Intro was from the Sick Kick remix of the Breaking Bad theme. If you haven't already figured out, I'm Jen Wilding, you're listening to TZM Global Radio, and this is the Breaking Bad discussion episode. And there will be spoilers. So if you still plan on watching the show and you haven't already, I do recommend you check that out first and then come back to this episode later. But for those of you who are ready to go, you've already seen the show, perhaps you're even a fan like I am, sit back. We'll begin with our discussion. I hope you enjoy. Okay, so we'll start with introductions. I'm Jen Wilding, and I'm based out of Los Angeles, California.
Hi, my name is Juan. I live in San Diego.
And my name is Mario. I live in Arizona.
All right, so Breaking Bad. I take it that you guys are also fans of the show and enjoyed it immensely because you watched it from beginning to end. So just first impressions of the series. Open up the floor.
Yeah, I became instantly hooked to Breaking Bad when I saw the first episode, the pilot episode, where Walt basically is featured with his tidy whities, and it looks like the cops had just pulled up and are coming to get him. And what I really, really liked about the show is, I'm sure what everyone really enjoys about the show, is just how good the writing is. Being a chemistry teacher myself, I related in many ways to Walter, especially more as time went on, a little less so at the beginning, but I did really enjoy how much detail they put into making sure that the science of Breaking Bad was consistent, or at least consistent enough that it really did reflect kind of what it's really like.
Yeah, definitely. What I really liked about the seasons was that they progressively got better and better, even with respect to writing and direction and everything. They started using a lot of those montages as it went on, but they weren't like senseless. They didn't just throw them in there. They actually like tied things in really well. I just really liked how it got better as the seasons went on, because normally shows kind of tank and they just start throwing in things that are filler, and I just thought that it was really good. It ended without being drawn out too long.
I agree. I had a hard time getting into it. Fortunately, other people had watched much more of it and kept recommending it to me, which pushed me to watch more episodes, because it took me about 3 episodes to get really even interested in the stories and the characters. I thought it was a little slow moving at first, but I did definitely think that once it picked up, you could see the talent there with the writing. And I know from talking with you, Mario, before that you were also a fan of The Wire, and it sort of reminded me of that kind of good writing that I enjoyed from The Wire. There aren't too many series that I can hold up as that's a good one to watch specifically because of the writing. Did you want to add anything about that in comparison to The Wire? I don't know if you had that thought.
I definitely had that thought. I mean, and it's also kind of similar themes in terms of just the situations that people are put in kind of determines a lot about what they become rather than the other way around. You know, The Wire was a little bit different, and in a sense I would say that The Wire is probably better than Breaking Bad in terms of the political and social issues surrounding it, because that was really what it was about. I mean, from its inception, the person that wrote the entire series was David Simon. He wrote for the Baltimore Chronicle and all that. I forget what newspaper it was called, but either way, he was very much aware of what was going on, and that's kind of why he did the show. He did the show kind of to put into a popular format the serious problems that exist in society, and that was kind of like one example. That whole Baltimore crime / social problems / schooling issues, and I think Breaking Bad was kind of like, I don't even know what they initially wanted to achieve with the show, and maybe that's because I kind of felt the same way as you. Like maybe the first couple episodes I was like, yeah, it's interesting. I mean, a guy is put in this, situation where he needs to make some money for his kids and whatever, and yeah, that's cool, but I didn't really understand where they were going with it. I don't even know if they knew where they were going with it, which oftentimes happens. They were just kind of like probably throwing out ideas, and one of them, the pilot probably stuck with a select audience, and they just decided to go with it. But where they ended up going was really awesome, because it had a lot of these different themes and undertones of the situation people are put in, and how it can really determine a lot about them. But, there was definitely some parallels between both of those shows.
Yeah, and watching interviews with Vince Gilligan, the person behind the Breaking Bad show, it did seem like they didn't know where they were going to go, that every episode they really wanted things to be organically what the characters would do, which is a great way to write because it seems very natural. And he had even talked about the writers ending up in places that they earlier on wouldn't have thought the character would have gone, but once the character went there, they knew it was the right choice for the character. And because I've listened to interviews, there's a specific moment I have in mind, but I may ask you guys about that in a little bit because it relates to some of the topics that I wanted to discuss in this particular conversation. Two, before I start into this, for me, one of the things I really liked about this series was that we get to see the main character, Walter White, in addition to other characters, but evolve over time in a big way. And we get to kind of guess on his motivations, but it just seems like an extreme evolution in a fairly short amount of time after he's given a diagnosis of stage 4 cancer, and he's sort of anticipating his own demise. And it's just so interesting what unfolds given this framework. But I wanted to talk about the role because specifically, as we're getting into this, I guess we should go ahead and state, I'm assuming people listening to this have watched the show, but to go ahead and state that the character Walter White, high school chemistry teacher, evolves into becoming a meth producer and getting into the whole business of creating this highly addictive drug and really almost seemingly falling in love with that role and what it does for him personally. But there's this whole evolution that gets him to that point that seems very natural, actually, I think. But what do you guys think?
So I did think a lot about that exact same evolution. And the thing about Walter, and especially as it relates to the market system, I think when we start thinking about people's motivations through life, and I can pretty much say with a lot of confidence that everybody would like to make something of value and contribute something of value to society. And Walter White's way of doing that was through chemistry, but due to certain events in his life, the character his wife getting pregnant with Walter Jr. pretty much takes his life down a course where he may not have been anticipating that. There's a internet meme that's kind of been going around, and I don't know if any of you have seen it, and it basically says that the moral of Breaking Bad was you should just pay chemistry teachers more. And the thing is that Walter White tried to find some sort of value still doing something related to chemistry, but wasn't able to fulfill his lifelong dream of being a famous chemist. That really it's just the motivation to want to be something greater, I think, is the thing that's really driving Walter White to become Walter White, the anti-hero.
Yeah, it's interesting. I also think that's really interesting that you mentioned how Vince Gilligan was saying that they didn't really know where they were going. I didn't know that. I haven't listened to any of his interviews or anything like that, but that was definitely the sense that I got. And with David Simon and The Wire, I really got the impression that he already had it very planned out, because every single season focused on a different aspect versus Breaking Bad. Like every single season of The Wire focused on a different perspective, from the street hustlers to the schooling problems that were going on in the school system to the political problems with the mayor to the police, corruption, etc. It was very well thought out and planned out. Breaking Bad was pretty well kept in a short amount of seasons. It was just kept to 5, which is good, but I really got the feeling that they were kind of unsure what was going to happen, because even when a huge plot line was that Walter had cancer, and then all of a sudden in one episode they were just like, oh yeah, it's gone, and that's it. Stage 4 cancer just got, it's no longer there, and they were just kind of throwing things out there because they just needed him to not have cancer anymore so they could focus on other issues. But even with that, it was still really cool where they went with it. But I think that the issue with Breaking Bad that was really interesting for me was indeed seeing that total morphosis that Walter goes through. And like you said, it was a natural progression. You could look at every stage of how he turned into kind of this really disgusting human being, and if you traced it back incrementally, you're like, okay, I can see why he decided to do that. I can see why he decided to start making more meth. I can see why he decided to start saving more of it. And I can see why he started to want to get other people out and start doing this and that. But by the end of the day, you reach that one episode where Skylar looks at him, and I think she says something like, I'm just waiting for the cancer to kill you or something like that. And you realize at that moment, maybe even before that, but you realize right there, it's like, this dude is like evil right now. You were cheering for him at the beginning. The first season, you were like, you were totally his best friend, and you wanted him to succeed, and you just looked at him as like an average, everyday guy that's put in a situation that sucks, and you want him to do good. But you realize that it kind of like totally changed everything about him. And at the end of the show, you want this guy dead. Like, you want Walter White dead, basically. I mean, if you're anything like me, at least, I was like, I can't wait for this guy to just die, But what was so interesting is how emotional it made me feel, and that was a credit to the good acting and the good writing. But it's just amazing that can happen to that person, And it is just a show, but that happens in real life all the time, in a microscopic way. Maybe not in the exact same way and to the exact degree, but that was what was so interesting to me about that show.
Yeah, there's the scene in the last season, or the second to last season, that you just reminded me about, and it's that big block of cash, just cold hard cash that Skylar has been putting away in a warehouse, and she just has it covered up with that tarp. And it really kind of really got to me about just that visual, and I think maybe it did possibly even strike other people, in that there are people out there in the world that basically have that amount of cash. And the thing is that when Walter keeps it's not enough for me to just make a few $1 million. I think I'm just going to have 100 times more, or whatever amount of cash that he wanted. Because the thing is that when you get to a certain point and you make so much money, that it's really hard to tell how much value really even creates for your own life, whether you have, $11 million or you have $10 million, and you're just simply doing something just for the sake, just getting on this wheel, on this treadmill, to just make more money for the sake of making more money.
Yeah, the thing is belief systems are so powerful that sometimes just the symbol of something can be as powerful as the person actually getting what the symbol represents, I guess, in that it seemed like here money represented power and freedom, but as a symbol. But when you look at what was actually going on in his life, the more money he was accumulating, the more restricted his life became, because he was involved in things that were so illicit. It goes from drugs to murder, and it becomes where every move has to be calculated, and it's not more freedom, it's actually less from that. But people don't make the connection, and it's bringing to mind a conversation I had with somebody the other day about just our lives and the jobs that we have, that a lot of people will go for a job that is a lot of money, and that it ends up being a huge responsibility, but the key is, I'm doing this because it's bringing me a lot of money. But then when they look at it, the actual cost-benefit analysis to their life is that it's stressing them out beyond belief. They're not getting good sleep. Their relationships are impacted in a negative way. Their health is impacted in a negative way. They're not properly taking care of themselves. You have to kind of wonder, what did that money from the job that was your initial reason for taking that, what's the real benefit there? And it kind of highlights where our values are kind of skewed, and that we're not really getting the result we're wanting. Clearly, Walt was wanting to, from it seems at the beginning, wanting to have his family set up and taken care of in the event of his death. And, that's on the surface what we think. But then as the story evolves, we start to see, well, maybe his actions aren't just for that reason. One of the things that was alluded to in the events as they transpired as to his motivation, there's one scene, I'll see if you guys can guess it, where we realize his motivation isn't the money. Do you remember at what point in the series we realize he's not really making his decisions based on needing money or wanting money?
Yeah, I remember that was, towards the end, basically he wanted to recapture some of his lost glory that he could have had if he would have not sold his share of that company that he initially founded. But I something else had come to my mind that from something that you mentioned, Jen, about the amount of freedom that a person might have, especially when you're making money so illicitly. But on the other hand, and then this is just kind of rhetorical, did Walt? I don't really think Walt had that much more freedom at the beginning, because it was just a completely different kind of slavery to the system, because he couldn't afford to leave anything behind to his family, and he also couldn't afford his medical bills because of the cancer that he got. So just in one way, I think it's one restrictive pattern, or rather one pattern of restrictive freedoms, really for another.
That's a good point.
So what moment were you talking about, Jen? I'm curious.
So this is something that I was reminded of when I saw the Vince Gilligan interview about this, and where they decided, the writing team, they thought he would go one way based on what the character has set up, that he wanted to be sure that his treatment would not be a burden to the family. So when the gray matter owner offers to pay for his treatment and give him a job, so it wouldn't even be a charity, he would be working for the company and have a position at the company that he was once associated with, that he has all the history with founding, and he turns it down. So I don't know if you remember that moment, but even when I was watching that, I was like, what? And from the interview I saw, it seemed like even the writers were sort of like, what? But then they realized, no, this is the way to take the character, and it because there's something deeper than that. Do you remember now?
Yeah, I'm just starting to remember. I actually didn't remember that he was offered a paid position. I remember that the guy was offering to pay for his medical bills and stuff. I don't remember, but that's really interesting. I kind of escaped that. That passed me.
Did you remember that one?
Yeah, I'm actually just remembering right now. That's an excellent point. I think that's also that really, I think, started to get the show down a certain line of events where we really got introduced to a lot of the depth of the characters, and so much so that I completely agree that it's almost like a Shakespearean drama, that Walter White, I mean, his downfall really was his pride, and basically if it hadn't been for that pride, then I guess there really wouldn't have been a show. But everything really started from this pride that he had, really from day one to the very last episode.
My question is always, was that pride something that was intrinsic to him, or was that pride something that sort of evolved out of him due to the circumstances he was in? Like, was that just something about him specifically, or could that have happened to anybody?
You got the feeling in certain episodes where they do like a flashback that that Walter White always kind of had his cockiness. You didn't really notice it in the first season when he's Walter White, the chemistry teacher who was about to die of cancer. But even Walter White had this like a little bit of cockiness when he buys. I don't know if you remember the episode where they do a flashback. He doesn't have a mustache, and they had just bought the house where they lived for the majority of the show.
What? How so? I don't remember that.
He kind of he walks in. He tells Skylar that this is just a little stepping stone. This is going to get us. This is just the first step in many big things to come. But that was basically 10, 15 years, beforehand, and the end result was that the job that he took as a chemistry teacher that he thought he was only going to have for a little while wound up being the job that he was basically not enjoying, that he was essentially in some ways slave to, because he needed basically that source of income to be able to provide for his family in the small means that he could, at least at the beginning.
I gotcha. So why is Breaking Bad, or is it important to think about in terms of how it relates to the Zeitgeist Movement, or to the idea of access-based economy or something like that? Or does it at all?
Well, I think one of the things that Juan was mentioning is that he didn't that money didn't give him freedom, is what we kind of talked about in his illicit stuff. And I also likened that to people who have just completely legal jobs, that it doesn't really give them freedom either. But then outside of that, not in the pursuit of money, you don't really have freedom either, because money buys you healthcare, money buys you more of the things that you need to survive in our current, I should say, environment. Everything's a commodity. So there's a sort of, to me, an advantage of thinking outside of that box and looking at what people really need. Like, here you have a man who is very talented in the arts of chemistry that could have created so much and could have contributed so much, and that would have been in line with what he wanted to do. Now, he might have been seeking fame for approval purposes, for self-esteem purposes, but what kind of environment would allow that a person like Walt with his talents to thrive and would create more of the same, like more thriving chemists, creating solutions and furthering humanity, making big contributions and feeling fulfilled in doing that. I think he could have gone that way if we were in an access economy.
Would have made for a terrible show, but
exactly.
Very much so.
Yeah. It's funny that Juan, you mentioned the meme that was out about paying chemistry teachers more. I saw another one out that was really fitting for Breaking Bad, because it said Breaking Bad in Britain or somewhere in the UK or something like that, and it was like, it had like a little storyboard outline of how it would go, and like the first scene was, "Sir, you have cancer, it's terminal." The second scene was, okay, maybe I should cook meth, and it was like, "Nope, you get free medical care, so everything's fine," and then the show ends.
Wow, that's really funny.
Yeah. I forget where I saw that. It was somewhere on Facebook, I think. I see everything on Facebook.
So yeah, you're right. We wouldn't have a show if this is about the conflict that's relevant. And really, I think what makes this show popular and why it was recommended to me by so many people were that people that were watching it were identifying with Walter White and then hating the character they identified with. And I think they were so fascinated by that process. What I was hearing from other people, I don't know if you heard the same, the show was actually highly recommended to me by a couple of people, but one of them was a guy who does pest control. And I thought it was perfect. I was like, no wonder he loves this show. And then I want to, in a bit, get into themes related to that. But what are your thoughts?
That's hilarious. But I had the same kind of process of how I responded to the show, because I was the exact same way. At first, I was very much sort of like rooting for Walter White, and then I just slowly started to really begin to hate this guy and just want him dead.
Yeah, I agree. That's the total genius of the show, because, for example, Jesse Pinkman, I didn't really like Jesse Pinkman too much at the beginning, and he evolves to really the character that I think everybody wants to see succeed, kind of in a genuine way, because he really does have a good heart throughout all of it. I mean, he really becomes kind of Walter White's conscious. And I also thought about just this is something that just from being a teacher that had come to mind watching the show. And obviously Jesse Pinkman was not Walter White's best student. In fact, he was pretty much the worst, or at least among the worst students that Walter White had in the context of that teacher-student relationship. And Jesse Pinkman's coming to contemporary school system, and really is just another picture of a student who can't really be served by that system. But even though Walter had basically failed him, he basically just, you're not a good student, you're not going to go into chemistry. And then Jesse Pinkman becomes really the next best chemist for making meth. And that's basically because of that mentorship relationship that Walter has with Jesse in the earlier seasons. And from an education point of view, I've always thought that maybe in a more of a resource-based economy, that's probably how education might function a lot more of this mentor-mentee relationship, rather than somebody who just is just trying to disseminate knowledge to a room full of students who maybe not really there to listen very much.
Yeah, I think you got it right with that for sure. I mean, not everyone flourishes the same way in a in a sort of like canned sardine type of learning environment, and you really can't quantify learning based on a time period. Not every sixth grader has the exact same intelligence level or even capacity for understanding a certain subject versus another as everyone else. Like you incrementally improve on things, and it's not necessarily dependent on time. It's dependent on a bunch of other things, which you can't really factor in. You can't, not necessarily factor in, but you can't structure something that way, or at least you shouldn't. But we really try to do that. And I understand why that happens right now. I understand why everything is structured that way, but it really doesn't, it's not conducive to really allowing someone that has a genius inside of them, and we all do actually, but it's not conducive for that to flourish, at least not for the majority of people.
These are great points. Jesse Pinkman was one of my favorite characters of the show. Him and Saul Goodman were among my favorites, and we can talk about that in a bit. But I love what you're saying about education. I can relate to it, and I've heard that the A students in our educational system really are just indicating that they're good at taking orders from someone else, and that the C students are the ones that become the entrepreneurs, the people who break out of the box. And I don't know that that's true across the board, but I can definitely see where that is true in that the educational system that we have isn't conducive to people doing real problem solving that's immediately applicable to their life, which to me, that's, even though it's within the drug world, that learning to be the best, make the best version of meth that you could make chemically, have it be chemically pure as a goal for Jesse, is something that he then strives for. It solves problems for him. And so that is a motivator, which is an organic motivator to education. And I think if we could find a way to create an environment where education is organic in solving real problems, then people could maybe be more motivated too. And again, obviously, in a research-based economic model, that is where the focus would be. So all the more reason to advocate that, because you wouldn't be preparing someone for assuming a job in the market system in order to earn money, in order survival tickets to live. So
yeah, I agree. I think that's another interesting point to bring up, is just we shouldn't necessarily have to pay or do anything just to live. I mean, that shouldn't be something that we need to automatically fit into the system and start getting, making money, getting a job, whatever, just to survive. I mean, that's just, and some people really disagree with that. Some people think that that's like really bad, and you really do need to, quote unquote, contribute to society. And oftentimes those contributions happen to be involved in endeavors that actually harm society. For instance, endeavors that are, you're working for a company that pollutes, or you're, working for a company that basically taxes people out of their livelihood or whatever, and we really don't need, I don't think we don't need to have a situation where people are forced to do that just to survive. I think that's one of the basic flaws of contemporary existence that we have on this planet.
I agree, and this is also where we get, all sorts of different professions that support all the other nonsensical positions that are just simply in response to the system that we live in. For example, Saul Goodman. Saul Goodman exists because there's a DEA, and the DEA exists because there's a mafia, and the mafia exists because there's a desire to gain monetary advantage over other people by any means necessary.
Right.
Yeah, it's all connected. And two, isn't it interesting that even Hank has a health conflict monetarily with his healthcare not covering the kind of rehabilitation that would really do the most good for him after he is recovering from the shootout. And it ends up being Walt's money from his illicit drug activity that is funding the rehabilitation of the DEA agent. I just thought that was sort of like a beautiful thing that's going on behind the scenes of how you're seeing how all of this is connected, and nobody's making the connections yet, but that in a strange way, all of these things are facilitating each other. I mean, that there is drug crime means Hank has a job. Those kinds of connections. I wanted to bring up something I didn't know if you guys noticed, but the to me, it finally got overt with some of the titles of the episodes, like I think it was like Bug and Fly and Kafkaesque, and the fact that they ended up doing their drug operation under the guise of pest control setup. There was a lot of imagery of insects and arachnids involving the transformation, and in particular brought to mind, because it is overtly referenced, Franz Kafka's The Metamorphosis. And to me, that was just beautiful in a literary sense. I really enjoyed that the writers were including that. There were insects on the drums of their chemical materials they were using. They were sort of like flies or bees or something. And there was the fly scene. There was the therapist that hears Jesse's description of the laundromat that he works at and says that sounds Kafkaesque. And Jesse then uses the term Kafkaesque later, and you know that he doesn't know what it really means, but he's using it. And also, one of my favorite scenes in the series was very, very small, but references the character of Jesse as, like Juan says, being sort of more of a conscious person, thinking about things. You mentioned him as being Walt conscious. Sometimes he does start to take on that role, but there's I don't remember the exact episode number or season number. I think it's mid-seasons. It might be season 2 or 3. But where Jesse is at the beginning of the episode standing on a street corner and there's a beetle crawling at his feet, and you can see him have the urge for a moment to just squash the beetle because he can, and he thinks about it and decides not to. And then a moment later, Skinny Pete walks up to him to start a conversation. He sees the beetle and without any further thought squishes him. And it's just, to me, that was one of my favorite moments of writing, and yet it was very subtle, but it summed up a lot of the transformation going on between people who were very shaped by their environment, being Skinny Pete, and just reacting and doing, it wasn't even a thought, it was just a reaction, which is what we start to see in Walter White. And then you have the person who really thinks about, oh no, I don't need to do that. It's not necessary. I can choose not to do that. And he refrains. So I'll let you guys comment.
I actually never noticed that. That's a phenomenal observation. And yeah, like I'm gonna actually go back and see those episodes, because I briefly remember exactly those scenes, but now with that detail, I think it's gonna really enhance next time I review it.
Yeah, and those were definitely things that happened as the seasons went on, because those type of things, those little nuanced type of examples of telling you a little bit about the character's development or telling you a little bit about how they're different from other people or how they've grown, those weren't common in even the second season, really, but they basically started happening somewhere around the third season onward, and that's why I really started liking the show a lot as it started going on. I became hooked on it because of that. I was actually going to stop watching it after the second season because it was just kind of like, okay, but then I started realizing that people were changing big time, and it was like things were happening that were very interesting. It wasn't just about the plot,
And the story of Franz Kafka's Metamorphosis is that there's a salesman who's transformed into a cockroach, and it just sort of happens, and it's not ever discussed in the story as to why that change happened or how it happened. It's just, it happens. And to me, that is sort of the summation of Walter White, where we know some of his thought process, but you can definitely see that it's happening as almost a very organic process, that he's becoming this sort of ugly version of a human that is becoming sort of cold and losing sight of his own humanity, which it seemed like he was trying so desperately at the beginning to preserve. And there's even those moments where we see, and I think maybe the episode with the fly is one of them, where he becomes very methodical about needing to kill the fly that's in their super lab, because it might be a contaminant, right? I think that's where he gets his OCD kind of goes off the charts, and you start to see him take such a turn that from that point forward, it's not even about flies. It's about you have to get rid of anybody that might talk and ruin his whole setup. And we even see that moment where he goes into the place where all the insects are. When he dives right under the house to get the money into the crawl space through all of these. I mean, like it's nothing, but most people would just be like, oh, he just dives through like that's his territory into the crawl space of the home to get the money, because he's just so motivated in that moment to grab it. And it's just, you realize he's just acting on that this primal impulse that he is connected with, this money being power.
Yeah, and your comment reminds me a lot also about Gus, who was basically had more things in common with Walt than things dissimilar to Walt. And I'm really fast. I mean, I don't know if there was I'm not remembering enough, but I don't think there was enough, or I don't remember enough of the background for Gus. If maybe you guys can fill in if we were ever introduced to how Gus became who Gus was, from this seemingly very mild-mannered restaurant owner to this drug kingpin. I do remember that there was a flashback to his youth where I think his buddy, I don't know if his buddy or his brother got murdered, but the transformation also I just find really fascinating too.
Yeah, definitely. I also like the fact that they brought up, because I remember some of the episodes, like the episode that was named Kafkaesque. I really like this absurdist themed works, because one of my favorite authors is Albert Camus, and a lot of people know some of his books that he wrote, like The Stranger, but one of my favorites is actually called The Fall, and it's about this guy that's living in Amsterdam, and everything's fine in his life. Everything's totally okay in his life, but at one point he walks across the street and he thinks he hears some people that were laughing at him. He's not even sure if they were laughing at him, but he hears some people in the back, just somewhere across the street, maybe even a couple blocks away, just laughing. And for some reason, that exact moment just takes him into this downward spiral, and you don't know why, and neither does he necessarily, and everything just goes to shit. And it's just like those kind of stories are really interesting to me, because it's like there's something underlying. Like, why would someone just break like that? Why did someone just turn into a cockroach all of a sudden? What does that mean? What's going on? And I think there's no maybe direct reasons, but it's like something underlying about the condition that we're all in right now, this existence that we all live right now. Like, maybe there's just something kind of wrong about it, about how things are going, and it just kind of creates these situations where we can just break for no reason necessarily, and we can't pinpoint it, but it's like underlying in there. But either way, that was really interesting to see that they started putting those themes in the show, because again, that showed that they were starting to go somewhere with it too. But yeah, I forget why Gus became the way he did. I remember, as you said, that there was that flashback where his friend gets shot. I can't even remember now if it was his friend or if he was gay and that was like his lover or something. But either way, that traumatic experience may have been the only explanation we have as to why Gus became kind of that cold, calculated dude that he is.
Yeah, I was going to say it seemed like that was a turning point that they highlight, and that's really all that you see is that glimpse. And you can definitely see how that would, if an event like that might change a person just with the gravity of it. But you're right that I don't think we know how he specifically gets into the drug business. I'd have to go back and see if that's referenced. One thing that's interesting about Gus and Walter White is that, and their similarities, as you mentioned, Juan, was that there's that scene where, and it's really great from a dramatic standpoint, where Jesse has shot Gail, but Gus is, I don't even remember the character's
Gus
name.
Kills Victor? The kid who was the guard, who was the Latino kid, basically, who was also standing guard in the lab. Is that who you're referring to?
Yes, that's the one.
Yeah.
When
Victor.
Victor was at the scene, and we know from our perspective as the audience that the reason that Gus decides to kill Victor is because he was seen. You know, they actually have a physical description of him being there that could potentially link them to their entire operation. Like, it's one of those things, like it's a loose end that needs to now get tied up. But the way it plays out in the way that he gets killed, when Victor is just doing everything, in that moment to be supportive of Gus's operation, and, he just gets his throat slit in front of them, Walter then turns on Gus and keeps saying, wow, we know what kind of guy he is now. But the thing is he made that decision based on the same criteria that Walt kills people, which is tying up loose ends. So it is very interesting that in that moment, he doesn't know that Victor is the loose end. He just thinks Gus went crazy. And it's where, if somebody's not following the Walter White story and you just heard about all of the homicides and killings that happened, you might think, oh, wow, that's what a kind of monster that person is. And he still is. I mean, they are to some extent. I'm not trying to defend their actions, but you're able to tie them up in a more logical way as to why they did that, to protect themselves. And they are similar, but it's funny to me that Walter, it then starts to be like, we now need to get rid of Gus because we know what kind of guy he is. And I'm thinking, well, he's the same kind of guy you are.
That's a really interesting point. By the way, I think that Fly episode actually won like an award. I forget if it was I forget what it was, but I think it won a couple awards.
Oh, really? I didn't hear that, but that's interesting. I've heard that they are in talks for a prequel spin-off on Better Call Saul, like to do a prequel around the character of Saul, which would be interesting if that comes to be a reality.
I also heard they might be doing like a movie.
A movie?
Yeah, but I'm not sure if that's going down anymore. I heard it from Jesse Pinkman's mouth, like the actor Aaron Paul, but I don't know if that ended up getting scrapped or not, because when he gave an interview, I don't recall him saying for sure it was definite, but they were throwing the idea around.
Interesting. I know that Bryan Cranston is writing a book now about his experiences during the show, and it seems like maybe he had a personal metamorphosis, but I don't know into what or from what. Interesting. But hey, you got to milk that for all it's worth, because it's good stuff for the career.
Yeah,
definitely.
So before we close out, we didn't really talk much about the actual drug part of the series. It seems like just that we don't really see much of the meth users, the actual people who are the end consumers of the product that make that business so viable. We mostly see people benefiting from the business, but not as much. I mean, there's a little bit of the plot dedicated to sort of the destruction around being an addict. But what are your thoughts on how drug users were portrayed or around the drug industry?
Well, I mean, there was obviously that reference, or the part where Jane, dies of the overdose, and Walt doesn't save her, basically to save himself. I don't know, or rather, at least as far as in general drug use, I think the thing is that they could have literally used any sort of vice. Obviously there was I'm sure there was kind of nuanced why they chose meth instead of, say, heroin or possibly some other drug. They could have possibly have done something even very similar if they had chosen cocaine. But I think it is somewhat of a secondary thing, because you would just as easily have had the same kind of armed thugs and shady characters if this had been almost any other contraband commodity.
Yeah, it could have been anything.
I remember thinking it was funny that when Skylar tries to explain to Hank and Marie what the problem is, it ends up that, well, he's a gambler and he's gambling all of their money away, and how much more acceptable that is.
Yeah, because it's kind of like if you have a substance abuse problem, you're going to be less stigmatized if you come out and say that you're an alcoholic versus I'm addicted to methamphetamine. And that's all. I think that's just kind of a symptom of the value system that's so out of whack, because some things are stigmatized when they're not nearly as bad as they really are, and some things are, just some basically it's just simply because of that societal acceptance of one kind of drug over another that I think allowed her to basically do that. And I think anybody in her position would have opted to come up with some sort of explanation that is, along the same lines, or at least consistent with, this is a vice, but this is a socially acceptable vice, so it's okay. You don't have to distrust us.
Right. I mean, I should be fair, as obviously he was a DEA agent, so she couldn't just come out and say what it was. But she didn't go to alcoholism or to any other. I just know you're right that I feel like we didn't really get the side of the root cause of why there's even a market for this. It's just about, from Hank's side, getting the bad guys, which are the drug producers and dealers. And even from the business side of the drugs, it's just, let's just sell the product, and there's almost just a complete disconnection of the people who are actually using the product and how it impacts them.
I just think that would have taken like another 10 seasons to get into, because that's a huge issue, right? But it is funny that Hank is like kind of just, his whole purpose is just to pop the bubbles on the boiling pot of water, thinking that that's solving anything.
Yeah, so that was just a side thought. You're right, it would be so much more, but it's another thing to think about when you're looking at the entire environment and how one thing plays into another. And I think as we go back to series that cover this, again, The Wire more beautifully covers those kinds of angles and does so more intricately. A lot of the same groups were represented, except maybe politicians, but definitely business owners and drug dealers and drug users and the education system and the police were all kind of linked in. You start to see, I like when any kind of series starts to crack open that things aren't so black and white, that the real gray areas that are there where one thing feeds into another, that really, that people are seeking a fix is part of our healthcare, mental health care, not really addressing people's issues, and that our environment is creating stress. And we know from the studies we talk about in the movement that a lot of that is created from the socioeconomic stratification. In countries where, there's a larger gap between the rich and the poor, you're going to have more of that, those issues that are going to be people turning to something like drug addictions, even alcohol, whatever they can get their hands on, and getting into these kinds of behaviors, and that the more crime there is, the more there is a need for police, and the more there is a need for law, which means, then the law becomes commodified.
Commodity
right.
worth even more.
What was that again?
Which makes whatever commodity they're trying to bring in or prevent from being brought in just be worth that much more, so it becomes that much more attractive and creates that, that sort of self-justifying loop, or rather it's just on an endless feedback loop, basically.
And these institutions that come out as a result of all these problems, they're not predicated on the notion of, well, eventually we won't be needed, so let's structure ourselves so that when we're not needed anymore, everything's fine. They're structured on the idea that they need to grow too infinitely, So it's like that's where you reach this crazy problem where no one gives a shit about actually solving anything. They just care about, like in The Wire, they do it really well, where they show very, very clearly how any institution that gets in place is also subject to the same rules of the game as an economic endeavor, as a company starting to create something, which is they need to self-sustain. They need to keep themselves alive too and keep growing. And so that's when you realize, like, wow, this is crazy. You get school systems where they don't even need to make students actually smarter. They need to just make sure that the tests look like they're smarter. And then that right there is like, wow, that's pretty horrible. But then it's like that with everything. Everything is based on the way you can make it appear to somebody, the way you can make it appear to the public, etc.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, the whole system is just predicated on having to basically justify your own existence, whether it's through something illicit or something that is deemed legitimate by society.
I think that's why a lot of people could relate to the show and Walter White in the beginning. Is I think people were like, yeah, this is an interesting story that a chemistry teacher is doing something that you wouldn't expect a chemistry teacher to do. And you could tell one of the kind of cool things about it is that he also has no knowledge or even real interest in it at the beginning. It's only after he realizes he's really good at creating the best product in the market that the industry becomes, suddenly it's like, okay, he's found his calling. There are those moments where, I don't know about you, but where even when he was going to deal with other drug lords, so to speak, like that initial one where Jesse goes to represent Tuco. So Tuco, where he goes to try to create a partnership with him, and he just gets the shit beat out of him. And then it's like Walter White decides, fuck it, I'm going to go and, I'm the one who has cancer. I'm dying anyway. I'm going to just go and do this business myself. And this guy's not going to get in our way. I'm going to get what I want. And he uses such a creative way to totally throw them off their game that I found myself cheering for him in that moment. Like, wow, what a great idea. But, that's where the show becomes interesting, where you even have to check yourself. Why am I advocating, his behavior in this moment, and what's that really about? He created the product that explodes.
Right. I was kind of cheering for him in that situation too, in a weird way.
Yeah, me too. I mean, everybody loves an underdog, including me.
And you wonder how many underdogs we'd be cheering for if we knew all the things that are going on. I mean, really, we can talk all day about corruption and how corruption is bad, but until we put it in a context, we don't know why it's happening or how it could really be prevented until we get to the root causes. That's why I like the Zeitgeist Movement focuses on in the education of what we talk about as being focused on what creates greed, instead of just saying, oh, somebody does this because they're greedy, to say, okay, well, ask the questions, go further than that. What creates that? And what really is that person looking to satisfy that they could have satisfied a different way? And when you start to answer those questions, it really highlights that our very structure of our system is not conducive to non-corruption. It is absolutely conducive to creating corruption, and then we just complain about it.
Yeah, and if you don't ask what the underlying issue is, then you're just constantly stuck trying to fix problems that are kind of above the surface, above the real necessary area that you need to address. And that happens with everything, too. It happens with healthcare. If you don't address the underlying causes and you just start treating symptoms only, it's important to do that. It's important to treat the symptoms, too, because people have things like pain or, and even in other aspects not related to health, it's important to treat the symptoms as well. But if you do only that, then you're screwed. And that's the least sustainable way to do something possible.
Yeah, I agree. And that's also partly why we have to continue, make the conscious effort to try to really educate as many people as possible, because not only are we fighting, the corporate dominance of all the media, but, I mean, people just like, psychologically, they like simple explanations. And a lot of people would rather just have a simple explanation that there's evil in the world, can't do anything about it. And there's greed in the world, can't do anything about it. There's going to be this problem, but, well, we can't do anything about it. Because it's just it's just an inherent property of the world we live in. But in fact, it's a property that's actually just created out of a result of the environment that we let ourselves live in.
And unfortunately, that's kind of the way that, the weird thing about that is that, and it's kind of a hard thing to get around, is that's a heuristic that we just have evolved in us. That's part of our kind of evolutionary biological structure is to just kind of look at things and try to instantaneously judge them and make a decision about whether or not, what causation is, how things are happening. And we just like to compartmentalize things and kind of like get them out of our head. We don't like to, the last thing that human beings like to do is keep things in their mind that are sort of vague or nebulous or something. And that's what a critical thinking person does. But it's really hard to get the average person to not think that way and to actually like try to think a little bit more deeply about things, or to think about things in terms of this could be right, so could this, and that's how you actually can get to a better understanding of something. But it's against our biology to do that, and we have to fight against that. And the only way you can do that is to sort of allow people to understand that actually to bring people's awareness to that fact.
I agree, and I mean that's because we're also fighting with our own biological hardware. Is 50,000 years or older, and although right now we think of ourselves as maybe collectively smarter or somehow more advanced, we're really still using the exact same operating system that we were using when we were running around savannas hunting antelope.
Yeah, and proof of that is like feral children. They don't, just because they're born today, if they're a feral child, they're not going to automatically have the same knowledge that everyone else today has. They're going to have the knowledge that they're exposed to. They still have the potential, but everything that we have today is sort of a culmination of a pilot light that was lit back in the day, and we've kept records and we've kept knowledge and all that stuff and passed it on, but none of that is actually inherent to any of us when we're born. It's just something that we have that's kind of like a process of upkeep, but it's nothing that we're born with. If we're not aware of our circumstances, then we can't do anything about it if we don't even become aware of it to begin with. And I think that's one of the main problems.
Maybe in some far-off resource-based economy, we might be able to reconcile our own biology with how fast our technology is moving, because we're still making we're still using like our old morals and our old ways of thinking to really try to cope with this world that we live in, and it doesn't always work out.
Yeah, actually, I was about to attend a conference, a little discussion about that. I live in Tempe, and they had a discussion at ASU. They have this, I think it's called the Origins Project, and it's kind of like they just like to get scientists together and sort of hold these discussions where the lay people can come over there and just kind of listen to them throwing ideas around. And yesterday there was a thing about, it was kind of vague, but it was about violence, it was about human behavior, it was about human biology. They had a lot of big names over here. They had Richard Dawkins, they had Lawrence Krauss, who moderated the event. I think it's actually available. I know it got recorded on, or it definitely got broadcast on Ustream. I'm not sure if it got recorded yet, but I'll make that available to you guys if you're interested. I haven't seen it yet, but I'm pretty sure some pretty interesting things were discussed at that point, because there was a lot of really knowledgeable people there. Steven Pinker was there as well.
Wow, that sounds pretty cool. Yeah, I definitely would like a link to that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, sounds good. So any last thoughts, particular scenes you want to talk about that come to mind that are good illustrations of the things we've been talking about?
I'll let Juan take that one if he wants, because it's been a while since I've actually seen this show, so it's not like fresh on my mind. Like the bug references you were mentioning, they kind of crept back in, but I didn't remember them off the bat like you did.
The bug reference was something that I caught on, I think because I'm terrible with consuming any kind of programming. I'm always on the writer's side. That's where my mind goes, is with the writing, because I've been a playwright, and I think about things from the standpoint of a writer. And so I know that especially when you have, television, you have more time to explore things and throw in things that you can lose later, but more so tthan movies. Those are very edited, and everything that you include in a film needs to mean something. Because there's not a lot of room for it to just be there because, and you can do that more with television. However, what I like with where television is going in general is that it's becoming more like just a longer movie in its way that it's concise. I think writing for television is getting better in a sense that you're getting to follow characters more deeply, but also writers are trying to bring the same quality to the small screen that you have from the bigger screen, and I've noticed that the scripts are tighter. And when I see something that is a recurring theme, I start to find out why the writers, I look for that. Like, when are they going to insert this again, and what's the meaning for them behind it? And I think the metamorphosis is the big theme, the transformation of Walter White and other characters, and in general of people when they're in sticky situations that they feel they don't have control of. They start to maybe become a different person or make decisions that would seem out of character, but if you were to follow them moment by moment, you'd see are actually more organic to their character trying to deal with things. And I just enjoyed the insect references from that point forward. And then once you know to look for them, if you were to go back and watch the episodes, you'll see them all over the place. You'll see where the camera follows a bug. Even when they're cooking, toward the end, in season 5, when they're cooking in one of the pest control setups in a home, and Jesse has left the business and Walt's doing it by himself with, I think, Todd. There's a little, I think, cockroach that is, and that's the other thing too, that is part of the metamorphosis of how much they become bug-like, is that they're even cooking in a house that is bug-infested. So that's the other, this is how far it goes, where you get to see the little cockroach on the outside just crawling around, and the camera follows it there. So you have to have, when you see it from the beginning to how much bugs are introduced and referenced, you start to see, I see, there's a sort of a transformation. If we're drawing from a human down to an insect as being sort of a disassociative, or the underground, or the dark side of an environment is where the bugs are. That's definitely there, and you can't miss it.
I was really struck by I think it was the last scene in season 4, where Walt plots to kill Salamanca as well as Gustavo, basically Gus. And you leading up to that season, there's you almost kind of get the feeling that Gus is like the devil incarnate. And after Gus walks out from the hospital room that had just blown up, and he is walking for a few seconds before you notice that the camera pans, and then you notice that he's missing half his skull, and he just falls over. What I really, really liked about that scene is how, well, for one thing, we do see later on exactly that Gus and Walt really are just one and the same. And if you consider the problem of mafias and illicit drug traffickers, kind of like a big like a big hydra, just because one facet lost its head, there's going to be somebody there to take its place. And as much as you try to eradicate with violence, these alternative economies, or these alternative illicit economies, somebody's going to be there to just pick it back up. And that doesn't really go away because we keep just simply doing the same thing over and over, and without actually looking at the root cause of why we keep coming back to that exact same problem.
What I got from the show was you just never know when a jet engine is going to land in your property too. I'm kidding, but I think there was a scene in there about that. What I really liked about this show and others is how you can have it really cater to a wide audience, and it can do things like cater to people like Jen, where they throw in references like that I didn't even necessarily pick up on initially, as far as the degree that you're describing about all these bugs that they're putting in there. But that's very Shakespearean too. The way that Shakespeare wrote, it was very much so that it would appeal to the lower classes, to the people that were just interested in kind of the sex and nudity or whatever. And also there was some really, really deep stuff embedded in there that people that were privy to it could pick up on it. And I think that's kind of how you have to, if you're going to do something that is going to be deep and meaningful today, you almost have to make sure that you're intertwining it with these other type of themes that can be popular or culture friendly, because otherwise you're just not going to get enough people. There's just not that many people that are interested in those kind of more meaningful aspects of a TV show. So I really actually think it's commendable to the degree that some people can do that. And The Wire is a great example of that. So is Breaking Bad. Hopefully we can get more of those out there. But there's definitely some that I do not think do that at all. And one of them would be an example of like Lost. I just think that's a garbage show where any deep meaning or anything like that in the show whatsoever. They kept alluding to it like maybe there will be something, but in reality that was just a moneymaker. They didn't do anything other than just drag it on to make cash, and I hate that because I wasted who knows how much time watching that one, but got absolutely nothing out of it. Breaking Bad was a different contrast to that. So the people that can actually do that, make a show like Breaking Bad, I really applaud them because it's hard to in this day and age because you're just not going to get the support.
Well, and I will say, I don't know that I'm not reading a lot more meaning into it than what they had, but I know at least subconsciously with the term Kafkaesque that they had metamorphosis in mind, and that's completely what's happening with the character. And from then it was just humorous to me that there were a lot more references. And I even again referencing the interviews with Vince Gilligan, when people are saying, there's so much to read into this, and he's like, well, sometimes we went deep, but a lot of what people read into it is just what they get out of it. And that's what's great about art, is that people see what they want to see. And it's reflective of ourselves. But I like when I think art succeeds for me when it challenges thinking or challenges a current perspective. And I don't know how many of us would have imagined enjoying watching a high school chemistry teacher transform into a drug creator, producer. Just the idea of that.
Yeah, definitely.
Only marginally like, okay, well, but the way that they did it and the way they brought in so many, and I will say the acting, we should give kudos to the actors. They were really strong in the series. And in addition to the writing, for me, though, I think there are a lot more actors that we would say that about if they're in shows with good writing. I think there's more of a lack of good writers than there are good actors. But I do appreciate that, like you said, Mario, that this is accessible on so many levels. There are people that don't have to think twice about, the root causes, that can just enjoy the characters and the story, because you don't know what's going to happen next, but when it happens, you're sort of like, oh, I know exactly why that happened after the fact. And that's when it's also good writing too, because they didn't get wildly just to make a story. I don't think there were too many turns that I thought were forced. The person whose story I followed the least that I thought was a little bit forced was that of Marie. Her kind of kleptomania, but it was another thing, is that these other characters became, and we haven't even really discussed that yet, but each character was involved in something that was to be hidden, like something that they weren't supposed to be doing, that they were hiding from other people. And I think that's pretty realistic, but we got to see each one of those. I think except for Walt Jr., I don't know who wasn't doing something they shouldn't have been doing. Even Hank was not following protocol in exactly what he was doing. He was kind of shady. But what else do you guys think?
Yeah, even Winona Ryder's a klepto, so it can happen to anybody. I didn't think too many things were forced in it either. That's kind of what I liked about it too. Aside from the fact that whole scene with the jet engine falling into someone's property was kind of strange, but I mean that's a little stretch. But no, in general it was pretty. You could look back and say, okay, I can see why that happened, or I can, that makes sense. So it wasn't very outlandish at all.
Yeah, I'd have to say that for the most part, I didn't really find too much of it contrived.
Yeah, and I guess part of the interesting thing with that event is it's sort of like a big news event in the world of Breaking Bad, that it's something that happens in their town that has a tie to their activity, and it seems like Jesse has some guilt about that, I guess, or I think it really. I don't think you find out until later all of the connections to that being Jane's father's incident that caused that accident and what played into his mental state was related to her death, which was related to their activities. But it does sort of take you from the micro to the macro of how the individual could impact the larger environment. I thought it was an interesting extra point to make.
Yeah, it was fun.
Definitely.
So before we wrap up, do you guys have anything else you want to add on the discussion of Breaking Bad?
I personally want to hear the chemistry teacher's perspective.
Well, yeah, I was just going to say, the show was, I thought the show was absolutely phenomenal. As I stated before, the actual chemistry part was something that I was very conscious of the whole time when I was watching what Walt was doing. And the portrayal of, when I've been in I've had the days when, kind of like in one of the earlier episodes when Walt is there feeling a little jaded in front of all these kids who really have absolutely no desire to be there. So for that actually really, I was able to relate a lot to that. I was not able to relate a lot to Walt at the beginning because I didn't really, I didn't really have a lot of his, or rather his background wasn't entirely like mine. I started relating a lot to Walt as time went on because I could see myself in, if I was facing dire straits or if I knew that that my life had an expiration date of maybe a few months, I probably want to start doing something that I would normally not start doing. I would probably try to do something to help my family out as much as possible. So that part is definitely very relatable, at least to me.
I just found the little storyboard picture I was talking about. It has kind of some like a little comic strip type setup, and it says, "Mr. White, I'm afraid you have incurable lung cancer." And he says, "But how will I pay for my medical treatments? This will bankrupt my family." And the doctor says, "Nonsense. The government will pay for your medical bills, taxpayer. What kind of barbaric society would allow medical care to hinge on a person's wealth?" And he says, "Oh, phew. In that case, I guess I'll go back to teaching chemistry." The end.
Funny.
Yeah, because we know that anywhere in America they have it all wrapped up. Everybody's all healthy. Nobody's selling drugs to get by. By the way, I heard there are recipes being circulated for Breaking Bad candy.
Are you serious? That's fun.
It was like blue sugar, melted sugar or something like that.
Blue crystal meth rock candy recipe.
Unbelievable.
I suspect that's what they actually used in the show. It was probably just like rock candy.
Crazy. Yeah, it does make you wonder when you think about, and this is a thought I had while watching it too, with chemistry people, again, with their talents, and wondering what in the past, like scientists we know, have helped to create nuclear weapons, and, what motivates them to do that, if not that there's a huge monetary incentive to do that. I don't know that many people that would professionally be excited about creating something so destructive unless there's a huge perceived reward from that.
Yeah, I mean, and most scientists, when especially the ones who discover something truly revolutionary or something that's truly going to change people's lives, if basically the Department of Defense is willing to give you a grant, even though you have absolutely nothing in your mind that could possibly have anything to do with defense, for example, that means that somebody's already thinking of a way to harness that to leverage power over other people. And I think a lot of scientists kind of who go in with the best intentions, and in fact I'd say that if not the majority, certainly a huge chunk of all the people who study science really do go in with idealistic reasons. And as soon as you realize that idealistic reasons aren't going to give you the kind of freedom, kind of freedom that you're looking for in life, because you might be tied to job or debt, that you just start to rationalize that, if I just make a few bombs, or I just make a few, killer diseases, then it's not like I'm making like thousands like this other guy. So I think it'll be okay. So my moral dilemma isn't necessarily as bad as these other ones, because it's really these other people who are making me do it. And it's just this self-perpetuating cycle, and unfortunately, That's unfortunately people don't ever recognize that we're kind of going to be running that same cycle of people getting in there with the best intentions, but what they say, it's like the old adage that the road to hell is paved with good intentions.
Well, there's that whole diffusion of responsibility thing too. I mean, I think that's how a lot of atrocities happen, is that you have the individual not understanding their connection of that they participate in this helps the entire thing go. Like, if you're not into war, but you're sending people off to fight, you're connected, and each soldier probably thinks, well, I'm just doing my part. I'm doing my small piece of this, and I didn't kill anybody, maybe even in my job, and they're not looking at that they were a cog in the wheel of that killing machine that is war. So they absolutely are an extension of it. And I'm sure that Walter White wasn't, we don't even see him really thinking about, even when he's in the scene with the meth addicts in their home, where the woman takes the ATM machine and bashes her husband's face in and kills him or whatever. You don't even really see Walt kind of have a moment where he's sort of like, wow, this is what meth really does to people. This is what something I create contributes to. Like, I'm a part of this. There's a complete detachment from that, and certainly with scientists in general, that there's a detachment of, hey, I just did my job and I need to pay my bills like everybody else. But, too, part of it is that there's no one person to blame, so we can't put them on trial and, fix it through our legal system. It really is about creating a mass awareness around everyone's being a cog in the wheel of a system. And that's the challenging thing, is that we don't have one person to blame for social atrocities, or a group of people, though certainly groups of people get blamed. We're all cogs in the wheel somewhere along the line, that we're participating in the monetary system, we're participating in a system that perpetuates poverty, that perpetuates war, that perpetuates devastation of our planetary environment.
Couldn't agree more.
Ditto.
Well, thanks for being willing to discuss this with me. I appreciate your insight. Thanks so much for being a part of this show project.
That was fun. Thanks.
Thank you for having me on, Jen.
This concludes our episode. Thanks so much for tuning in. If you're new to this information, the Zeitgeist Movement in particular, and you want more information about it, what's this resource-based economy thing you're talking about, or this access-based economy, or getting to the root of our social problems, if that interests you, please check out our resources, our website, thezeitgeistmovement.com. Also, we have a new book out that kind of puts things in perspective and lays it all out for you if you want to go that extra step. It's called The Zeitgeist Movement Defined, and it is now available on Amazon.com.